I'm so excited about this conference, and it's such an honor and pleasure to welcome you. This has been a dream, some of us, for a long time. You'll hear more about that. So I have a few opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to Sean. And I want to start with a poem that most of you know, or a verse from a poem that most of you know, I think, from Jonathan Swift's On Poetry, a Rhapsody from 1733, though that's outside the period that we're talking about today. So geographers in Afrique's maps with savage pictures fill their gaps, and o'er uninhabitable downs place elephants for want of towns. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to Harvard, where today and tomorrow we'll dive into the fascinating and too little understood subject of Christian Africa and medieval Africa from 300 AD to 1600 AD. In other words, the millennium or more that stretched from the reign of Constantine I in Rome all the way to the time of Shakespeare's first production of Julius Caesar during the reign of Elizabeth I. When I was a kid growing up in the 1950s, Africa was a shadow, the invisible shadow that both framed and stalked the existence of every African American. But since then, thanks to so many of you assembled in this room, we know so much more, especially about Africa in the period that we're exploring tonight and all day tomorrow. Indeed, the last generation's discoveries have been nothing short of a revolution, as far as I'm concerned, a neo-enlightenment, if you will, revealing a Christian and medieval Africa that has forced a reckoning with the past, as well as a recentering of the story. Here's just a very rough timeline of some of the facts that astonish me, to give you a sense of the revolution that we're living through in our understanding of Africa in this long time period. Very long time period, starting with African creativity found in the Blombos Cave of southern Africa, where, as you know, the Atlantic and Indian Oceans collide 80,000 years ago. The birth of ironworking technology in the Central African Republic between 1800 and 1500 BC. Meanwhile, the development of steel in East Africa, dating back to classical times. The spread of Bantu culture across the whole of Central and Southern Africa, verified with archaeological evidence and DNA evidence, before the arrival of Europeans, 1500 BC to 400 AD. The spread of Christianity in Africa. Many people are not aware of how deep the roots of Christianity run in Africa. Early monastic practices in Egypt's eastern desert date back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and Christianity, of course, has been in Ethiopia since about 350 AD, and Nubia from about 450 AD. Although Ethiopia's Christian history is a bit better known, few know at all about the Coptic Church in Nubia in the days when Nubia extended south almost to Khartoum. And of course, even fewer are aware that the Kingdom of Congo became a Christian kingdom just before the end of the official Middle Ages in 1491. Other breakthroughs in scholarship are expanding our knowledge in this area. For example, scholars have been using newly discovered inscriptions and documents to push back the origins of Christianity in Nubia, while excavations of the churches of Nubia have turned up some remarkable works of art. We now know quite a bit more about how the Nubian church functioned. Also, the discovery of secular documents embedded in old religious texts on the margins or on back pages has enriched our knowledge of the most mysterious periods, such as the Zagwe period in Ethiopia, when King Lalibela, later recognized as a saint, of course, of the Ethiopian church, oversaw the construction of several churches belonging to an astounding complex of churches. These churches, carved out of rock in the Ethiopian highlands during the 12th and 13th centuries, were older than many of the august cathedrals, of course, of Europe. At the same time, amazing work in editing text has shown us so much more about the history of art and religious controversies in Ethiopia. Also, far more attention is being paid now to how the Ethiopian church interacted with the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. For instance, we've become so much more aware of how important the community of Ethiopian monks that lived in Rome was for the development of Catholic and even Protestant doctrine. You can think of the emergence of Calvary states in Senegambia between 500 and 800 AD. The emergence of states like Benin in the forest regions of Africa between 800 and 1300 AD. The transformation of Islam by African converts on the continent. The first conversions were around 900 AD. The work was done before 1100 AD. Muslim Africa and its Mediterranean empire in Spain and Portugal. This, of course, is the Almoravid movement after 1050 AD. The development of trade and gold across the Sahara started about 500 AD. Mansa Musa, of course, if you Google networth.com, you'll find out that he's the richest man who ever lived, embarked on his lavish pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, and whose legacy includes the claim, of course, that he was the richest man in the world, which I happen to like and love to propagate. The development of kingdoms in the savannah, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai between 500 and 1500 AD. Congo is the early site for the development of the state in Central Africa from the 13th to the 15th century. Yoruba Benin and the development of beautiful sculpture and images, as my dear colleague Suzanne Blier, who's here somewhere, has established around 13th century for Ife and 15th to 16th centuries for Benin. East and Central Africa's relationship with China, trading of gold and exotic animals for rare Chinese porcelain in the 14th and 15th centuries. There's some authority for believing that in 1306, the Emperor Wadim Arad of Ethiopia sent a diplomatic mission to Christian Europe, but scholars such as Samantha Kelly, who I believe is in this room, argues that this mission is of doubtful authenticity. There was also a mission to Venice in 1402 from Dawit of Ethiopia. Another mission followed to Aragon in 1428, at which it was proposed that the royal houses of Ethiopia and Aragon engage in a diplomatic marriage exchange. Still another mission followed to the Council of Florence in 1441 and one to Naples in 1450. It should be noted that a community of Ethiopian monks, as I mentioned earlier, resided in Rome in the late 15th century, and they contributed their language, Ge'ez, to an 8-language edition of the Psalms, the Psalter, printed in 1504. Martin Luther, in addition, met in 1534 with an Ethiopian deacon named Michael to discuss theological issues, as a scholar named David Daniel was recently established, finding a letter from Martin Luther dated July 7, 1534. The presence of other Africans, often Nubians or Ethiopians, in the Europe of the Middle Ages, is highlighted in the image of the Black and Western art, which I've had the pleasure of co-editing with David Beinman, and in new books such as Miranda Kaufman's Black Tudors, The Untold Story. There were more Black people in medieval Europe than anyone 20 years ago could possibly have imagined. Earlier this year, PBS aired Africa's Great Civilizations, my 6-hour series attempting to showcase 200,000 years of African history from our common human ancestor, mitochondrial Eve, all the way to the resistance to conquest in Africa at the end of the 19th century, none more successful than the stand that Menelik II made with his army against the Italians on the plains of Adwa, March 1st, 1896. The aim of the series was to show, with the help of many people in this room, that Africa, contrary to myths of isolation and stagnation, has been embedded in the world, and the world embedded in Africa from the most ancient of times. We see the Atlantic Ocean, the Red Sea, the Nile, and the Sahara as highways, not as barriers. Thank you for being here and for the work that you're doing to ensure that the story of Christian and medieval Africa is never lost again. Thank you to those who have made this conference possible, including our co-sponsors, the Committee on Medieval Studies, in particular, the committee's administrator, Dr. Sean Gilsdorf, who teaches here at Harvard, the Center for African Studies, the Department of African and African American Studies, especially our chair, Larry Bobo, the Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard's Provostial Fund for the Arts and Humanities, and please also give it up to my colleague in the English department, Nicholas Watson, whose original idea of this symposium was. Please give it up to Nick. At the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, which I have the pleasure of directing, I'd especially like to acknowledge the heroic efforts of our executive director, Abby Wolf, and Dr. Kevin Burke, our director of research, David Beinman, our permanent evergreen fellow, and to my friends John Thornton and Linda Haywood, who have been invaluable sources about Africa for me, just as Chris Arrett has been. I look forward to being with you over the next day and a half, to learning from you and to listening to one another as we look to advance the story of Africa in all of its many dimensions for a rising generation. I hope you enjoy the fellowship and communion of this special, indeed historic conference at Harvard. It's not Africa yet, it's still Harvard. And the inspired friendships and scholarship it engenders. Thank you.
Do you want to show the clip?
No. You had a clip from the series. It's all seen it, right? You have to leave.
I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'm Sean Gilsdorf. I'm the Administrative Director for the Committee on Medieval Studies here at Harvard. Before handing things over to our keynote speaker, which of course is what people really want, I just wanted to add to Skip's thanks to everyone who helped make this possible, to all of our departmental and center co-sponsors. A special word of thanks to Matt Weinberg and to my assistant, Hannah Weaver, and of course to Abby, my co-organizer for this conference, and everyone who has shared their enthusiasm and support for this. And I really hope that the conference lives up to everyone's expectations. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Stephen Davis. Stephen received his BA from Princeton University in English and Hellenic Studies with a thesis on Yeats and Cavafy. And Stephen's academic trajectory, I think, is proof that a liberal arts education can send you in any possible direction. He then earned an MDiv from Duke University and his MA, MPhil, and PhD in religious studies at Yale. After 4 years teaching New Testament and early church history at the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cairo, Steve returned to Yale, where he now is professor of religious studies, as well as, so ready yourself, an affiliate in history, Near Eastern languages and civilizations, archaeological studies, Middle Eastern studies, Hellenic studies, humanities, medieval studies, and lest he find himself with too much free time, is also head of Yale's largest residential college, Pearson. The intellectual diversity and richness that's represented by Professor Davis's administrative and teaching commitments are even more evident in his writing and his research. I first encountered Steve through his online translation of Hunayn ibn Ishaq's important but too little known 9th century treatise, How to Discern the Truth of Religion, one of a number of critical and sensitive translations of medieval Arabic Christian texts that Steve's given us. These, however, are but small rivulets within his Nilotic scholarly output, sorry for that, a river whose tributaries include 50 articles and book chapters on the archaeology, liturgy, hagiography, literature, and manuscript culture of late antique and medieval Africa and the Near East, multiple edited volumes, and 6 monographs, among them his far-reaching 2001 study of the cult of St. Thecla, a prize-winning 2004 history of the early Coptic Church and its leaders, the brilliant Christ Child, Cultural Memories of a Young Jesus, published by Yale University Press in 2014, and the soon-to-appear Monasticism volume, I'm sure many of us are thankful for this, in Oxford University Press's very short introduction series. In turn, Steve has been a devoted advocate for scholarship across the disciplines, serving on the editorial boards of the Brill series Arabic Christianity Texts and Studies, the North American Patristic Society's Monograph series, and the journals Orthodox Christian Studies and Hawliyat Qibtiyya. Most recently, he's launched Fordham University Press's Christian Arabic Texts and Translation series, which will make the rich and important story of Christianity's development during and after the rise of Islam available to English-speaking teachers and students. Just as important, and perhaps even more significant, if that's possible, has been Professor Davis's tireless and pioneering work to uncover, both literally as well as figuratively, the material record of late antique and medieval Egyptian Christianity, both before and during the rise and after the rise of Islam. Since 2006, Steve has served as executive director of the Yale Monastic Archaeology Project, a wide-ranging series of excavations focused on 2 major regions of early monastic settlement, Wadi al-Nathrun, which is ancient Scetis, west of the Nile Delta, and Sohag on the edge of the Western Desert. The work of the Monastic Archaeology Project has transformed our understanding of the cultic, social, and economic networks that defined Egypt's Christian communities, in particularly the monastery of John Kolobos in Sketis and Chenoweth's White Monastery near Sohag, both of which remained active centers of Coptic spirituality for over a millennium, and whose remains still have much to teach us. More recently, Steve launched the project to catalog the Coptic and Arabic manuscripts in the Monastery of the Syrians. Beginning in 2013, Professor Davis and his team have surveyed and carried out a systematic analysis and cataloging of the rich manuscript holdings of the Monastery of the Syrians in Wadi al-Natrun, a vast corpus written in Coptic as well as Arabic, and comprising biblical texts, other sacra pagina, liturgical materials, hagiography, theological writings, ascetic guides, sermons, canons, commentaries, and more. The importance of this project for understanding how Christianity developed and ramified in the Byzantine, Islamic, and African world cannot be overstated. And the output of Professor Davis's team, including editions, catalogs, analytical studies, and digitized manuscript collections, already is proving to be an immensely valuable resource for scholars of early and medieval Christianity, social and cultural historians, students of manuscript and early book history, and many, many others. In short, I can imagine no one better to kick off our exploration of Christian communities, beliefs, institutions, and practices in the early African world than Stephen Davis. Please join me in welcoming him tonight as he takes us on a journey from Moses the Black to red-haired Ethiopians, monastic multiculturalism, and discourses of ethnicity in medieval Egypt. Stephen Davis.
It is an honor to be here. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I can actually imagine a lot of other people would be better to do this than me, but I'm going to do my best to do justice to this illustrious gathering. You have a handout. You should have a handout with you. Does anyone not have a handout with them? Do we have other copies? The handout should be 2 pages, 4 sides. And I'll be making reference to it at different stages during my lecture today. I'm going to be taking you, I'll ask you to bear with me. I'm going to be taking you on a bit of at the beginning of this lecture, on a kind of definitional journey, which is deconstructive in nature. And then I'm going to try to put some pieces back together. In the children's books section of the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology bookstore, located right across the Charles River in Brookline, Massachusetts, one finds a listing for a 16-page picture book entitled The Abbot and the Robbers, Saint Moses the African. The title alludes to the life story of an early Christian monk named Moses. Formerly the servant of a government official in Egypt, Moses was dismissed for theft and became the leader of a roving band of robbers. After one robbery went awry, he became conscience-stricken and converted to Christianity. He was consecrated a monk, ordained a priest, and eventually became the leader and mentor, the abbot, to 70 monastic disciples in the desert of Sketis, modern Wadi Natrun, about which I'll have a lot to say today. This account is originally found in the Greek Lausiac history, written in the early 5th century by Palladius of Galatia. If you look on handout page 1, section 1, I have some excerpts from that text. In that work, Palladius describes Moses as black, in Greek it's melos, and Ethiopian by race, Ethiops to gene. Thus, in subsequent centuries, late ancient and medieval Christians came to know of him as Moses the Black, and or Moses the Ethiopian. And one of the early monasteries in Sketis came to be named after him, the monastery of Moses the Black. Here is a map of the region that I'll be focusing on primarily today. So an overall map of Egypt, and then this conglomeration of monasteries in the lower right, lower left. In this Greek Orthodox picture book, however, where Moses is presented as a hopeful model of piety, perhaps for little kids in the habit of stealing their brothers or sisters' toys, I'm not sure, he is called Moses the African, a title that, to my knowledge, is never applied to him in pre-modern sources. This authorial act of naming or renaming reflects a set of modern assumptions whereby the descriptors Black, Ethiopian, and African are culturally conflated. In late ancient and early medieval Egypt, the relationship between these adjectives was much more complicated. My talk today will touch on some of these complications. Christian Africa, medieval Africa. The title of our symposium presents us with a host of methodological and historical challenges when it comes to the question, what is it that we are referring to when we talk about medieval Africa? In order to give those challenges a fair hearing, I want to enter into dialogue at the outset with a 10th century Arab Muslim geographer, Ibn Hawqal, using his work as a context for marking and challenging a certain kind of unhelpful essentialism or positivism that has sometimes prevailed in historical scholarship on Africa in the ancient and medieval periods. This essentialism comes into expression in a variety of forms, but it has one thing in common: an implicit operating assumption on the part of some that Africa, conceptually as a continent, as a geographical and or cultural setting for human populations, has always been perceived on some level in the same terms as it is today. One sometimes finds this assumption at work, for example, when modern categories of religion and race are uncritically deployed as frameworks for examining pre-modern peoples and settlements. I'll get to that in a moment. In the first part of my lecture, the testimony of Ibn Hawqal will, I hope, help illustrate the need to resist assumptions that posit an Africa conceived in terms of an unproblematized continuity from antiquity to the present day, and the need for us as historians to consider carefully the various and sometimes contradictory terminologies and cosmologies applied in pre-modernity to what we in our time call Africa. In the second part of my lecture, I will then turn to Egypt as a context for considering the role that multiculturalism, migration, and discourses on ethnicity played in the medieval period, using the history of Ethiopian monks in Egypt and Egyptian views of Ethiopians as a pair of case studies. Let me now turn to Ibn Hawqal as my initial interlocutor. I'll begin with a map, and you'll see this map at the bottom of your first page of your handout, which has the Arabic labels as in the original manuscript. What you see here is one of several maps included in manuscripts of Ibn Hawqal's work, Kitab Surat al-Ard, that is the book on the image of the earth. An examination of its contents should, quite literally, overturn a number of our assumptions as we think about medieval geographies of Africa. On the back side of, on page 2 of your handout, you'll see a version of this map with numerical labels and a key to those different regions. So let me try to orient you to what you see here. First of all, the map is inverted in relation to our own standard systems of directionality. The south is at the top, the north is at the bottom, the west is to the right, the east is to the left. What appears to be a small island in the bottom right is labeled as the Roman Empire. This is number 32, Rum, with Constantinople at one extreme, number 33, and France and Spain at the other, 42 and 43. The rest of the territories demarcated on the map consist of a single landmass in two principal sections, neither of which, notably, bears a main label. The bottom left section is subdivided into many smaller regions, including, for example, Gog and Magog in the northwest or lower right, that's number 44. The region of the Arabs in the southwest or upper right, number 61. China in the northeast or lower left, that's 83. The upper right section of the map is partially bisected by the river Nile, which bears a series of 3 labels beginning near its source and continuing along its flow northward, downward on the map. The first of these labels marks Nubia, Dongola, and Alwa. That's number 9. The second, Upper Egypt, and the third, Lower Egypt. Those are 10 and 11. To the left, that is to the east, one finds Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, number 26, in Arabic, Balad al-Habasha. Along the lower coast to the right, one finds the land of the Maghrib, which is subdivided into smaller regions and districts: Barqa, Sort, Ajdabiya, Tripoli, and notably, Ifriqiya, Africa. These are numbers 13 through 14 and 14. Finally, at the upper right, the southwest, one finds the kingdoms along the ocean, quoting there, which include one Muslim country along with several so-called infidel lands. As we can see from this map, what we think of as Africa is definitively not delineated as an independent continent. Indeed, apart from the island of the Roman territories, the map represents a world landmass that is populated by multiple smaller geographical regions or districts. In Arabic, the equivalent is nawahi, countries, bilad, and kingdoms, mamalik. The only place where the Arabic word for Africa, Ifriqiya, appears is in labeling a subregion or circumscribed set of districts within the Maghrib, part of what is now known as Northern Africa. This is consistent with preponderant late ancient Roman designations of proconsular Africa as a province. For most inhabitants of the early medieval world, the term Africa designated a particular district or region and would usually not have been conceived of as having a larger geographical scope than this. Ibn Halqal's geographical witness belies certain modern scholarly attempts to attribute an African cultural or geographical identity held in common by pre-modern peoples who lived in territories as disparate as Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, let alone the Maghrib and other parts west. One example of such an attempt is found in recent work by the Center for Early African Christianity. Founded by the late Thomas Oden, the project is now, as I found out in checking this on the web, apparently based in my hometown of New Haven, Connecticut. According to its website, the center's purpose is to provide resources for, quote, African Christians using classic African sources. In his book, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, published in 2007, Oden himself uses the term early African Christianity to refer to, quote, all the early forms of Christianity in the first millennium in the 4 billions of square miles of Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, and possibly farther south. Defining Africa in antiquity as, quote, the massive continent that stretches far to the south of the Mediterranean, he grounds the continuity of what he calls, quote, the distinctively African experience in, quote, the African soil. Oden asserts this essentializing association of African geography and experience from Tertullian and Cyprian to the present day, despite acknowledging historical tensions and incongruities in the way that the term has been applied historically. I'll give you a quote exemplifying this. Quote, the most generic name of the entire continent has, from time immemorial, been simply Africa. That's from Oden. As we have seen, Ibn Halqa's testimony shows how this monolithic conception of an eternal Africa is simply historically untenable when it comes to the study of the medieval period. So what is the utility, then, of using Africa as a collective framing device for our work? There may be as many answers as people attending this symposium. In Oden's case, he is engaged in a missiological endeavor. He wants to create resources for contemporary sub-Saharan African churches by grounding those communities in an early Christian theological heritage of African provenance. For others among us, myself included, this subject of study may come with a different set of ethical or ideological obligations. For example, to retrain our attention on non-European histories, especially in the global South, to shed light on the prehistories of colonial practices, and to bring historical scholarship into closer dialogue with critical perspectives emerging out of race, indigeneity, and ethnicity studies. As I will argue today, to accomplish the latter goal, when it comes to the study of the late ancient and medieval periods, it is necessary to destabilize static or fixed conceptions of race and ethnicity, and to decouple them from their traditional association with an essentialized African identity. In Odin's work, for example, one sees how his conception of an eternal Africa gets tangled up problematically with modern, especially North American, racial categories. Even as he critiques certain racial assumptions at play in the representation of Black Africa, he nonetheless conflates questions about skin color and African geographical identity. Here he is commenting on early Christian theologians such as Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine. Quote, "What convincing argument can be set forth to deny their Africanness? How black were the Christians of North Africa? Black enough if blackness is understood in terms of intergenerational suffering and oppression. If black is defined by skin color, a trip to Numidia or Nubia or Ethiopia settles the chromatological argument." I will not dwell here on the unexamined assumptions and anachronisms lurking amidst Odin's arguments. Suffice it to say there have been other far more nuanced treatments of ancient views on race and or ethnicity applied to Africa in the work of other historical scholars, such as Frank M. Snowden Jr., Martin Bernal, Lloyd Thompson, Malvern Van Wyck Smith, and Denise Eileen McCoskey, just to name a few. And yet, even in the case of these other scholars' foundational contributions, their work also occasionally allows problematic modern assumptions to creep back into their discourse in ways not fully acknowledged. This can come in the form of framing research questions anachronistically in terms of, quote, the relationship of blacks and whites, in the case of Snowden, or associating the African roots of classical civilization with an undifferentiated black racial identity, in the case of Bernal, or aligning the adjective Ethiopian too restrictively with a particular so-called black somatic type, in the case of Thompson, or aligning the ancient idea of Africa with certain genetic or physiological markers, in the case of Smith. Needless to say, this is contested and controversial ground, and my intent here is not to underestimate the importance of previous field-shaping studies. I simply mean to highlight the fact that all of us, as historians, face the same difficulties in our efforts to combat the prejudices of our own guild while simultaneously trying, and sometimes failing, to avoid falling into the same traps. As a way forward, I want to propose an approach or set of approaches that acknowledges and takes ownership over the way we use modern concepts and methods to frame our work as historians, even as we all try to hew as closely as possible to the textual and material data on the ground. In this lecture, I want to try out a more localized, region-specific approach, one that is sensitive both to the social practices of specific communities and to the discursive representations that shaped medieval perceptions of ethnicity and religious identity. Before I proceed, however, let me say that I use the term ethnicity advisedly here, drawing especially on the insights of Frederick Barth, Avtar Bra, Yasmin Gunaratnam, and Denise Eileen McCoskey. 3 points are worth emphasizing from the outset. First, I regard ethnicity, like the modern category of race, as a social product, not simply a biological one. In Gunaratnam's words, it is produced through, quote, social discourses enmeshed in lived experiences and institutional and social power relations. And it is observable in, quote, the specific nature of the practices involved in producing particular forms of social difference at particular moments. McCoskey, who treats ethnicity and race as convergent in her scholarship on antiquity and its legacy, defines them in terms of, quote, a perpetually negotiated field of engagement, grounded in discrete practices, not only in the writing of philosophical and ethnographic treatises, but also, quote, in everyday acts, habitual procedures of daily life, and more routine-seeming activities. So, in my academic discourse, I'm treating the category of ethnicity as socially constituted. Second, the co-constituted discourses and practices that determinatively shape perceptions of ethnic identity are not only internal to the groups in question, but are also bound up in external acts of othering. Frederick Barth describes ethnic groups as culture-bearing units and organizational types characterized and bounded by both self-ascription and ascription by others. As you'll see, due to the nature of the available evidence in my case studies, much of the data that I will be mining from Egypt pertains to the way that Ethiopians were ascribed as such by others. Third and finally, if we are to attend to questions of ethnic identification in the medieval period, it is vital to think in terms of relationality and movement. In her book, Cartographies of Diaspora, Avtar Bra has written about diasporic space and genealogies of dispersion as contexts for analyzing the situatedness of ethnic identity. Gunaratnam has underscored the importance of what she calls multi-sidedness as a cartographic strategy. As we shall see, practices and conceptions related to diaspora, dispersion, and migration play key roles in shaping the history of Ethiopian monks in Egypt and medieval Egyptian perceptions of Ethiopians. So, with these insights in mind, let me turn to my case studies, the first of which focuses on the Egyptian monastic center at Skidus, modern Wadi Natrun. Located in a low-lying desert zone west of the Nile Delta, this is approximately midway between contemporary Cairo and Alexandria, Skidus was one of the most active monastic settlements from late antiquity to the late medieval period. And since its establishment in the 4th century, it attracted would-be monks, not only from different parts of Egypt, but from also places further afield. As such, during the medieval period, it was an environment characterized by both multiculturalism and mobility. What did such multiculturalism and mobility look like on the ground? And what place did Ethiopian communities occupy in this social landscape? From early generations of monasticism in Egypt, immigrants to that region constituted a notable percentage of its monastic population. In the late 4th and early 5th century, one of the most celebrated desert fathers associated with Skidus was Arsenius the Great, who hailed from Rome and had formerly served as an imperial tutor under the Emperor Theodosius I. In the early 5th century, a monk from Gaul, modern-day France, named John Cassian, also visited the region along with his companion Germanus, probably spending at least several years there. Cassian's literary masterpiece, entitled Conferences, is partly modeled after Plato's Symposium. In it, he records his spiritual dialogues with the monks of Skidus, beginning with Moses the Ethiopian. Indeed, Skidus was the place where Moses himself was ordained a priest and lived out the bulk of his ascetic life. His monastic practice and teachings are commemorated in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and 8 out of the 13 stories about him in that collection are explicitly set in Skidus. In the medieval period, the multiculturalism of Skidus and international movement of monks became even more pronounced. By the 8th century, 2 of the most prominent monasteries marked their special association with founders or with communities of monks who hailed from other places. The monastery of Baramus derives its name from the Coptic Pa Romeos, meaning belonging to the Romans, a designation variously attributed to 2 founding legends. According to one, its founders were Maximus and Domitius, sons of the 4th century Roman emperor Valentinian I. The monastery of the Syrians, perhaps established in the 6th or 7th century, became connected with a large community of Syriac-speaking monks, at least by the 8th century. This Syrian contingent, which seems to have cohabited with a community of Coptic-speaking monks, remained active into the late medieval or early modern period. Its presence is attested by surviving inscriptions, and wall paintings in the main monastic church, and by the contents of one of the world's most important Syriac manuscript collections. By the 11th or 12th century, in addition to the monastery of the Syrians, other analogous language group monasteries were established in the region, including a monastery of the Armenians and a monastery of the Abyssinians or Ethiopians. The Armenian monastery probably had its roots in the arrival in Egypt of an Armenian patriarch, Gregory II, and in the work of his successor, Manakes, an Armenian monk who lived in the desert of St. Macarius, Skytis, and helped secure, quote, an agreement of the Copts, Armenians, Syrians, Abyssinians, and Nubians on the Orthodox faith. This is attested in the history of the patriarchs. The presence of Ethiopic-speaking monks in Wadi Natron most definitely preceded the establishment of a dedicated Ethiopian monastery. The Ethiopic Synaxarium, a collection of saints' lives, commemorates a monastic superior in Abyssinia named Andrew, who, quote, received the monastic habit at the hands of our father Abba John Kama. John Kama was the 9th century founder of one of the monasteries in Wadi Natrun in Skytis. So this Andrew must have initially apprenticed as a monk there. In addition, several medieval metropolitans of Ethiopia were recruited from the ranks of the monks in Skytis. These include a 9th century monk named John from the monastery of Baramus, a late 10th century monk named Daniel from the monastery of St. Macarius, and an early 12th century monk named George from that same monastery. This robust traffic in metropolitans and patriarchs would have been matched by an equally robust traffic in manuscripts. During the medieval period, the monastery of St. Macarius and the monastery of John the Little would have been instrumental to this textual commerce and exchange. Those were the two biggest libraries in the area during the medieval period. I'll have more to say about the monastery of John the Little in a moment, especially regarding its role in extending patronage to an offshoot community of Ethiopic-speaking monks. But the most tangible evidence for the local transmission of Ethiopic texts comes from the manuscript collection at the monastery of the Syrians. In 1837, when Robert Curzon visited the library at that monastery, he reportedly found, quote, perhaps 50 volumes belonging to a remnant of Ethiopic monks there. Since 2013, I've directed a project to catalog the Coptic and Arabic manuscripts at the monastery of the Syrians. And as part of that effort, I have documented and plan in the future to have cataloged a total of 15 surviving Ethiopic volumes. 4 are biblical texts, 1 a collection of saints' lives and sermons, and the remaining 10 liturgical works. This small collection probably traces back to the Ethiopian monks that Curzon encountered during his visit there in the 19th century, and perhaps even further back to their medieval forebears. We'll see what the manuscripts themselves tell us. We also have evidence of Ethiopian monks as readers of texts. In one case, an early modern copy of the Psalms, one reader's note is marked with the name Razik Abu Habashi, which loosely translates Razik, the Ethiopian father. As I mentioned, this monastery of the Abyssinians emerged as an offshoot of the monastery of John the Little, and 3 pieces of evidence from the 12th century would seem to corroborate its existence. The first is a polyglot version of the Acts and Epistles, which presents the biblical text in 5 columns, in Armenian, Arabic, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopic. The second piece of evidence is a circular marble altar tray preserved in the monastery of the Syrians with a bilingual inscription in Greek and Nubian, commemorating a Nubian King George who died in 1158. Evelyn White, whom I'll mention later, who studied a lot of this material, operated on the assumption that the Nubian and Ethiopic monks lived together. Now that's something that we might want to explore a little bit more, whether that's a justified assumption. The third is the colophon, third piece of evidence, is a colophon of a Coptic manuscript now preserved in the British Library, containing, among other works, an encomium on the prophet Elijah by John Chrysostom and a homily on the Transfiguration by Ephraim the Syrian. The thematic connection here to the prophet Elijah is significant. A colophon in the text indicates that a certain monk named Apostauros at the monastery of John the Little, and who was identified as a spiritual son of the, quote, dwelling place of Pehot, gave this manuscript as a gift to the Holy Church of St. Elijah, the great prophet. We know from later sources that the monastery of the Abyssinians and its main church were dedicated to the prophet Elijah. Thus, this text and its donor, Apostauros, stood at the nexus, I think, between the monastery of John the Little and the monastery of the Abyssinians. What more do we know about the relationship between these two communities and their ultimate fate? Let me try to give you a sense of the social organization of medieval monasticism in Wadi Natrun, and then follow up with later textual sources on the monastery of the Abyssinians. Since 2006, I've been conducting fieldwork in Wadi Natrun as founder and director of the Yale Monastic Archaeology Project, YMAP. And over the past 12 years, my team and I have spent multiple seasons surveying and excavating at the monastery of John the Little. Our primary focus has been on a monastic residence constructed of mud brick, measuring 25 by 25 meters and dating to the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. So here you see a plan of this building. These are organized around a central courtyard with an entrance over here. We have two different kitchen emplacements, a main one here, a minor one here. And room 3 happens to be a room which preserves parts of what was originally an extensive wall painting program, as well as multiple wall writings. So it's a kind of room that is often described as an oratory, a place of prayer. Here you see an image of it during the course of excavation, with that room 3, some of the wall paintings starting to emerge in the foreground. This is from another angle where we see one of the ovens in the kitchen in the foreground here. And here is a view of room 3 after excavation. By the medieval period, excuse me. So from these painted wall writings, called the Pinti, within the residence, we know that it was the same kind of dwelling place described in the colophon about Apostauros. The Coptic term here is ma nshopi, place of residence. It becomes a standardized form in Coptic, designating monastic residences like this, eventually is transliterated into Arabic as Manshubiya. So you'll hear that term thrown around as well. The monastery of the Abyssinians probably began as just such a dwelling place, although most likely larger than the one we excavated. We chose it because it was relatively small and manageable. And as I'll show you, there are larger ones. Originally dependent upon the monastery of John the Little, it eventually seems to have established itself as an independent, or at least semi-independent, monastic foundation. This happened perhaps at the same time that the Church of St. Elijah was dedicated. Our surface and subsurface surveys in the area confirm the presence of around 80 such structures. So here is a survey map of the area, and you'll see this is the church of John Little, which is surrounded by a walled enclosure. There are a couple of other walled monasteries in the area. All of these other mounds, these are mounds of sand that collect over remains in the desert, mark the place of buildings. So about 80 unexcavated structures. So by the medieval period, the immediate area featured at least 8 other monastic enclosures. These included the monastery of St. Macarius to the south, the monastery of St. Bishoy, the monastery of the Syrians. Oh, excuse me, before I get there, this is actually the same survey map and placed over a satellite image. The archaeological zone, and the thing that I'm talking about is building B, which is located at a distance from this. So if we imagine what this landscape looked like, it involved all of these walled monasteries, sort of monastic centers, with a lot of these smaller houses, places of residence, populating the landscape between them. The survey data show a variegated social landscape. And one of the I think the advances of our knowledge is it used to be that we thought that there was a kind of linear progression of a kind of like solitary monasticism and then a semi-solitary monasticism to a communal monastic forms. And what this shows that even as late as the 9th, 10th century and afterward, you have the coexistence of these different types of monastic practice in the same area. So this was the context in which I'm imagining this community of Ethiopian monks establishing themselves in this local area. This mixture of Cenobitic walled monasteries and semi-autonomous houses or dwellings. The testimony of visitors and an important manuscript witness indicates that this social configuration continued to characterize the Abyssinian monastic community into the first half of the 15th century. By the year 1330, the Coptic Patriarch Benjamin II visited Wadi Natrun to inspect monasteries that had suffered structural damage by an infestation of white ants or termites. An account of this visit, preserved in a work called the Book of the Chrism, makes mention of the Abyssinian monks who dwelt in the monastery of John and in the neighboring cell, the neighboring Manshubia, who joined together with the local Coptic monks in the community, praising God and honoring the patriarch when he came to visit. Later that same decade, a German priest named Ludolf of Suchem visited Wadi Natrun as part of an itinerary that took him to the Holy Land and other sacred sites in the Eastern Mediterranean. He wrote about his stopover as follows, quote, "Likewise, in the Egyptian deserts there stand at this day so many cells and hermitages of holy fathers that in some place, I believe, for 2 or 3 miles, there is one at every bow shot. At the present day, very many of them are inhabited by Indians, Nubians, and Syrians, living under the rule of St. Anthony and St. Macarius. Given late ancient and medieval geographic, cultural associations of Ethiopians with people from the Indian subcontinent, Ludolf's mention of Indians and Nubians is probably a reference to the monastery of the Abyssinians and its associated residences, still active at the time of his visit. Our latest evidence for this Abyssinian monastery comes from a manuscript copy of the Pauline epistles dated to the year 1419. Originally written for a prince or chief named Aida Farzan, it was later transferred to the Abyssinian monastery in Scetis. The manuscript contains monastic rules related to the monastery, which is referred to as the sanctuary of Saint Elijah. Shortly after this, sometime in the first half of the 15th century, the monastery of the Abyssinians was abandoned. But this did not mean the end of an Ethiopian presence in Wadi Natrun. Indeed, beginning with the Muslim historian al-Makrizi, our later sources underscore the local mobility of this community of Ethiopian monks, who underwent what we might call a series of intra-regional micro-migrations. According to al-Makrizi, the surviving Abyssinian community relocated to the monastery of the Virgin of John the Little, another one of these local dependencies. At this time, the populations of the monasteries had declined across the board, perhaps due to a plague or associated famine. And Makrizi reports that there were very, very few monks left in these main monastic centers. All the monasteries Makrizi mentions were probably closely associated, originally dependencies of John the Little. Thus, the micro-migration of the Abyssinians may have been measured in hundreds of meters, but it would not be the last migration of that population within Wadi Natrun. The English traveler I mentioned earlier, Robert Curzon, visited the monasteries in the region in 1837, and in his account of his visit to the monastery of the Syrians, he describes his encounter with a small remnant of Abyssinian monks who occupied, quote, a building with a flat roof which stood in the southeast corner of the enclosure, close to the outer wall. There they maintained a consistory and a library. When Curzon heard chanting, a Coptic monk informed him that it was the singing of this Abyssinian contingent and offered to show him their chapel. According to Curzon, these monks had, quote, their numbers recruited occasionally by pilgrims on their way from Abyssinia, Ethiopia, to Jerusalem. This is a sign that the mobility of this Ethiopian community extended to translocal and trans-regional movement as well. Finally, in the early 20th century, when H.G. Evelyn White, I mentioned him earlier, was conducting research for his magisterial 3-volume work on monasticism in Wadi Natrun, he was aware of 7 Abyssinian monks residing at the monastery of Baramus, perhaps transplanted there from the monastery of the Syrians at some point in the intervening years since Curzon's visit. So up to this point, I have been tracking different monasteries and monastic groups in Wadi Natrun according to their communities of origin, as reflected in the medieval writings of Egyptian authors and European visitors. But recent scholarly work on multiculturalism and migration by David Kurtzer and others has helpfully troubled this framework by shifting attention away from groupist views of ethnic association to more nuanced conceptions of social differentiation and cohesion, with an eye toward the intersectionality of ethnicity with gender, class, religion, and other factors. Here it is important to note that when we narrate the history of Ethiopian monks in Wadi Natrun, or of Armenian or Syrian monks for that matter, it is a story not simply of a sharply bounded group identity, as sometimes portrayed, but one characterized by complex lines of organizational dependency and autonomy, by shared doctrinal commitments and communions, by a host of male-gendered homosocial bodily dispositions, by multilingual settings of ritualized and everyday practice, and by intra and extra-regional movement and mobility. Suffice it to say, there is much work yet to be done to write a historical ethnography of monasticism in Egypt that does fuller justice to this rich and complicated terrain. Any historian aspiring to write such a history also has to grapple with the late ancient and medieval ethnocentric discourses that simultaneously cloak and characterize that terrain. To gesture in that direction, I want to conclude my lecture today by examining how Ethiopians were seen through the eyes of others in Egypt, and what such representations might tell us about the malleability of ethnic identity in such a multicultural context. In 2001, David Brackey wrote an article entitled Ethiopian Demons, Male Sexuality, the Black-Skinned Other, and the Monastic Self, in which he showed how Ethiopians were in fact not so fixed in their representation by late ancient monastic authors, but rather deeply ambivalent subjects. Thus, as Brackey documents, they took the form of, for example, demonic tempters and tormentors in sources such as the sayings of the Desert Fathers, the Life of Antony, the History of the Monks of Egypt, and the 2 works I mentioned earlier, the Lausiak History and John Cassian's Conferences. By the same token, they also could become signs of redemption and sanctity, as in the case of Moses the Black. Moses' case shows the crisscrossing lines of color coding in monastic discourse. 2 stories about him are especially telling, and I'd refer you to your handout page, section 3 here. 3a gives us one of these stories, where we find the other monks in Sketis treating Moses with contempt, supposedly in order to test him, saying, quote, "Why does this Ethiopian come among us?" In response, Moses keeps silent. In a second story, this is handout 3b, after Moses is ordained and receives the white robe of the priesthood, the archbishop tells him, "See, Abba Moses, now you are entirely white." Moses responds, quote, "It is true of the outside, but what about the one who sees the inside?" The story then goes on to describe how when Moses tried to enter the church, the other monks drove him out, saying, "Outside, Ethiopian." Moses responds by speaking to himself, quote, "They have done right by you, O ashy-skinned black man. Since you are not a human being, why should you come among humans?" These words endorse the monastic cultural stigmatization of black skin as a marker of subhuman identity, while at the same time enacting and embodying the particularly monastic piety of humility. Taken together, these two accounts leave the reader in a place of ambivalence with regard to the Ethiopian figure of Moses, whose identity appears to be the subject of discursive exploitation and irony. Both stories describe acts of monastic social exclusion, apparently justified on the grounds of Moses' inescapable skin color. And yet each time, Moses' response, in the first case silence, in the second self-abasement, marks him as the one in the story who truly embodies monastic piety, whose holiness stands in implicit critique of the other monks' ethnocentric judgments. To make matters more complicated, in the second story, Moses is represented simultaneously and alternately as both black and white, binary categories that are here both reinforced and deconstructed, calibrated and recalibrated along the lines not only of skin color, but also of dress and interiorized piety. In these stories, Lloyd Thompson's association of Ethiopians with a particular black somatic type is supported in part when considered in discursive terms, but it is also revealed to be an eminently malleable ethnic construct, subject to manipulation for various social and religious ends. Let me conclude with a final example of how such discursive malleability and manipulation may call into question certain prevailing perspectives on the study of race and ethnicity in the pre-modern world. It has been argued by Thompson and others that late ancient Roman attitudes reflect ethnocentric bias rather than racial prejudice because, and I'm going to quote from Robin Law, who wrote the review of Thompson's book, quote, "They did not have a concept of race defined by descent rather than appearance, far less an assumption that such descent, as opposed to cultural criteria, ineluctably defined a person's position within the social structure." Fair enough, perhaps. But Thompson's otherwise judicious attempt to avoid the intrusion of misleading modern assumptions about race may have had the unintended effect of obscuring the ways in which such pre-modern ethnocentric biases still could be heavily invested in the construction of genealogical lineages of descent and hierarchies of social status and power. I began my lecture with a 10th century Arabic geographer, Ibn Hawqal, and I will end with a late 12th or early 13th century Arabic work entitled The History of the Churches and Monasteries of Egypt, a gazetteer that documents a large number of ecclesiastical and monastic sites up and down the Nile. These geographically organized entries include one dedicated to Abyssinia. And I refer you, this is or Ethiopia. In Arabic, again, it's Balad al-Habasha. And if you'll refer to handout section 3, I'll lead you through some excerpts. So this particular entry, and I'll refer you to 4a, describes how Abyssinia was under the jurisdiction of Egypt, the see of Mark the Evangelist, and long ago was the home country of the Queen of Sheba, who traveled to Jerusalem, quote, to hear words of wisdom from Solomon. The entry then goes on, this is 4b and c, to describe the practices of the king of Abyssinia and how all the kings of that country are ordained as priests. It also describes, this is 4d, the local traditions surrounding the Ark of the Covenant, which is placed upon the altar and over which the liturgy is celebrated 4 times a year in the palace of the king. Finally, the author describes the priests who preside over this liturgy. I'll read from 4e. Quote, "And the ark is attended and carried by a large number of Israelites," literally children of Israel, Beni Israel, "descended from the family of the prophet David, who are white, bayd, and red in complexion, humr, with red hair, shukr. It is said that the negus," this is the word in Arabic is el-Najashi, referring to the emperor of Ethiopia, "was white, abyad, and red of complexion, ahmar, with red hair, ashkar. And so are all his family to the present day. And it is said that he was of the family of Moses and Aaron, on account of the coming of Moses into Abyssinia, Moses married the king's daughter. In this passage, we see emerging traditions linking the Ethiopian clergy and royal caste to the priests, prophets, and kings of Israel. In it, we see how Egyptian discourses on Ethiopians and ethnicity continued to show a remarkable malleability in the medieval period. To underscore this point, let me return briefly to Ibn Hawqal. In his book on the image of the earth, the medieval Arabic geographer conventionally characterizes Abyssinia as part of a larger climatic zone that he calls, quote, the land of the blacks, Balad as-Sudan, and describes its inhabitants as having a color, quote, approaching that of the Arabs between black and white, Baina as-Sawad wal-Bayad. It is in the context of such a shifting ethnographic backdrop that the Egyptian editors of the history of the churches and monasteries presented their own picture of Ethiopian priests and kings. As white-skinned and red-haired, these elite ritual actors are placed at the other end of a gradated color spectrum from their darker-skinned Ethiopian compatriots. They are Ethiopian Israelites, represented as heirs to a royal, prophetic, and priestly lineage. What we encounter here, in fact, is a biblicized genealogy, the textual and discursive creation of a line of descent signaled by certain inherited physical markers. The description of the royal priesthood's hair and skin color notably echoes late ancient and early medieval traditions about David, who is described in 1 Samuel as ruddy or red. The first century Jewish author Josephus, in his Antiquities, describes David as xanthos, an adjective often, but not exclusively, applied to hair color, meaning yellow, frequently with a tinge of red, so perhaps strawberry blonde or light auburn. This theme found its way into medieval Arabic literature. For example, in the 10th century, Thalabi, in his Tales of the Prophets, wrote that, quote, David was blue in both eyes, ruddy of face, in Arabic this is ahmar al-wajh, red of face, fine-limbed, lank of hair, pale-bodied, in Arabic, abyad al-jism, white of body. The editors of the history of the churches and monasteries of Egypt seem to have picked up on this theme, inferring that the Ethiopian Israelites' ginger hair was attributable to their Davidic lineage. This connection would probably have been facilitated by emerging medieval traditions about the Ethiopian Queen of Sheba and her involvement with David's son and successor Solomon. In the first century, Josephus had already reported on how an unnamed queen of Ethiopia had sought out Solomon, spurred on, quote, by a strong desire for his wisdom, and how Solomon, quote, was studious to please her in all ways. Beginning in the medieval period, this suggestive story would eventually be extrapolated into later traditions about a love affair or marital union between the queen and Solomon, which yielded both the birth of a royal offspring, justification for the kingship, and the gifting of the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. The history of the churches and monasteries of Egypt may provide us with our first historical allusion to Ethiopian traditions about this royal lineage and its connection to the Ark. The further tie-in to the family of Moses and Aaron, including the coming of Moses into Abyssinia and Moses' marrying of the Abyssinian king's daughter, is meant to extend that lineage back even deeper into the history of Israel. The references to Moses are probably an allusion to his Ethiopian campaign. This is a story narrated in the fragments of Artapanos, preserved in Eusebius's 4th century preparation for the gospel. In that account, the Ethiopians and their priests come to love Moses so much they adopt Israelite ritual practices. And Moses is described as ruddy, that is, red in complexion. I would argue that in the history of the churches and monasteries, we get a glimpse of a particular medieval ethnographic construction of a social hierarchy in which the ruling priestly and royal castes are distinguished from other Ethiopians. They are read as Israelites and elevated in standing, at least in part by virtue of this discourse of color coding. Just as in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, Moses the Black remained silent after having been ostracized by his fellow monks, just as he was summarily banished by them from the church, so too in this medieval history, darker-skinned Ethiopians remained invisible mute, conspicuously absent from the sacred precinct. The observed result is a complex negotiation of ethnic identity, framed along the intersectional lines of pigmentation, social status, royal and ecclesiastical authority, and differentiated access to the sacred. To study medieval Africa, if we are to call it that, is to trace such movements and intersections in detail, drawing on the full range of resources available to us, whether from contemporary approaches in race, ethnicity, and migration studies, or from the historical disciplines of cartography and ethnography, archaeology and manuscript study, monastic literature and biblical interpretation. I look forward to hearing more from our distinguished panel of contributors tomorrow about the rich and textured ways their own current research is advancing our understanding in these domains. Thank you very much.
So Professor Davis is happy to take some questions.
Great. Oh, I loved it.
Thanks.
Just observations.
Yep.
You can respond whatever way you want.
Yep.
The tradition of Moses being black has a long history in the African American tradition.
Absolutely. Yep.
Moses, man of the mountain.
Yep.
This is, you can take a look at that from the
Sure.
late 30s or early 40s. But it's, oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Moses has been black a long time in black to black people. That's what I was going to say. One, Zipporah, the Cushite, was Moses' wife, right? According to the Bible, a Cushite. So that the kingdom of Cush, we all know that. So, huh? The two wives? Two wives, okay. But the first one or the second one was the Cushite. The second one was the Cushite. So I wonder how that figures in to the descriptions of Moses, because obviously that interracial marriage, as it were, was inscribed a long time. Secondly, what about the tradition of the Ethiopian monasteries, which go back? I climbed and filmed Debre Damo, which is 6th century, at the risk of my life, of being.
I really want to go there, but I have a fear of heights, so I'm not sure.
Oh my God, you're dragged up. For those of you who don't know, there's only one way up, is the rope. And so basically an 80-year-old monk dragged me up. I didn't have no skin on the front of my, and I thought I was going to have to spend the rest of my life there because I was too afraid to come back down the rope, but I did. So again, with the flow of the Nile, what do scholars think about the flow of monasteries from Egypt to Ethiopia and Ethiopia back? Because we know Debre Damo was there by the 6th century, right? Then the next thing is, what did the Ethiopians themselves say? I'm fascinated, like many people are, about the whole discourse of Prester John and the way that Prester John's identity changes, and from India to white to black to whatever, over a very long period. And so this text is late 12th or early 13th century. The letter appears in 1165, I guess. About.
I don't know a lot about it, but dating is
Right.
contested.
Yeah, and then I'm interested. The final thing is what the Ethiopians themselves say, because they justified the founding of the Solomonic dynasty after the Zagwe dynasty with this, the birth of Menelik, the son of Solomon and Sheba, et cetera, and then that's inscribed in the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian holy text. Chris, when do we date the Kebra Nagast? When do we date the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian holy text? Do you remember? Does anybody know?
Yeah, well, the versions that finalized subsequent.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah, that's why in treating this particular source, I couldn't presume.
Right.
That's why I was saying that this is one of our earliest attestations of a tradition that we see more full blown.
Right. Great. That's my list.
I mean, true confessions. I mean, this is an area that I'm just beginning to explore, and I know that. So, part of my goal in trying to put this together was to speak. Part of my goal in trying to put this lecture together was to try to speak about materials about which I could speak competently, right? And so that's why I was circumscribing the fields of investigation in a particular regional context where I have some context to work with. In the process of doing that, I've begun to learn about a lot of the literatures and other loci that you're referring to. There was a frustration that I experienced in researching this because a number of that literature, including that text, come later than the period of focus for me in this study. I see this as the beginning potentially of a larger project in which I begin to expand out. My main area of interest is monasticism. I want to go back to your first question about like biblical references to Cushites and things like that. One of the things that I'm interested in is the ways of engagement with these biblical texts, and that's a variegated field. And so, like in the sources that I was dealing with, you don't see references to that. That doesn't come to the surface. But I don't want to presume that, for example, in Ethiopic sources that might come later, you would see that exegesis coming out in a variety of ways. I don't know as much as I'd like to know, and part of that was because I was trying to circumscribe my field of investigation.
Oh, you did a brilliant job.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I tremendously enjoyed that. First, an observation I had, because I come at the Desert Fathers through the Latin tradition and know the collations well. I had never realized that the first two collations are by Abbot Moses the African. Because Negritude is not mentioned. No Ethiopic. There's no mention of Abbot Moses's racial or ethnic identity at all in Cassian, which I think is quite interesting in its own right. But he does start the collations. He gives the first two of the collations, and they're two of the most important texts for the whole of the Western monastic tradition. Of course, the first two of the collations. Sure. They really are about how you fashion your inner identity as a monk or a hermit, and so it's a remarkable thing. And I'm ashamed of not having done that. I guess the question I wanted to ask...
Can I say just one thing before you move on? One of the interesting things I found in doing this research was, if you know the translation of the Sayings of the Desert Fathers by Benedicta Ward, in this story about Abba Moses, she translates the Greek word Ethiopian, Ethiops, as black man, which is very interesting. It shows the ways in which those categories come together for translators. Yeah. And that gives us as readers of those translations a challenge in teasing apart whether those connections, whether that as a translation would have been conveyed in the same way within the original context or not.
Yeah. Well, the word Ethiopica comes, I've got it in front of me here, comes 3 times in the collations. And always in reference to diabolical visions. So and so I do think that I think that it's a different text, but Benedicta Ward has a certain...
And that's work that David Brackey has really pioneered in terms of those readings of the...
But I really wanted to ask, because you started off by sort of deconstructing the notion of Christian Africa, and I don't want to contest that, but I'm interested in the way that your sites suggest a continuity and a communality about holy identity and the identity of a holy place over 1,500 years, which links communities which still understand themselves linguistically and maybe by population in relation to different parts of northern Africa and elsewhere. So to have an Ethiopic monastery that survives for 1,500 years presumably needs to be renewed generation after generation. Now, that's the main thing I know about monasteries, is that on the whole you have to get your new inhabitants from outside, and so this suggests presumably a network of a migration network and a cultural network that's extremely stable, that links, or does it not, that links this mobile Ethiopic monastery, I guess this is Skip's question really, with Ethiopic monasticism itself, and does similar things around for the other I'm thinking actually of living in Hamilton, Ontario for a while, where there were 5 Catholic churches on my street, each of which celebrated Mass in a different language, and had kept for 150 years deep roots in Raccolmuto in Sicily or wherever it was in Spain and that kind of thing. So it does sound as though that long continuity over
Right.
1,500 years is maintained.
Yeah, I mean, the sense I have from, again, the sources we have are so fragmentary in attesting to the existence of this particular community. And they often refer to them as I said, in a more groupist sense. And you see that, for example, in the identification that they have their own chapel, right? Or they have their own library. So there were certainly like social, institutional ways in which their identity within these larger communities, even when they didn't have their own monastery, they were distinguished. But there also, I imagine, there would have been overlaps in a variety of ways on a day-to-day basis. And that's what I was trying to get at, even though the sources don't always give us the kind of purchase that we want. I mean, your idea of renewing this community is interesting. I mean, one of the things I would observe in the contemporary Egyptian landscape, I've worked very closely with Coptic Orthodox monks who extend hospitality to me on a regular basis when I'm in their library or working on sites contiguous to their monasteries. The monastic population of Egypt looks very different today, and this is a post-Nasser phenomenon, that sort of nationalism of Egypt. It's become much more thoroughly Egyptian, with the exception of the monastery of St. Catherine's and its sister convent in Sinai, which is Greek Orthodox. You don't see monastic communities taking that multicultural form in the same way. And that's worth its own, I think that's worth its own social analysis to extend, if one wanted to extend this up to the latter half of the 20th and early 21st century.
Nicholas, Thomas talked to me. I don't know if they talked, I wasn't there, but they talked to me.
Yeah.
Maybe they were glad to see me because they had talked for 1,500 years.
Yeah.
Today.
Oh, interesting.
So now I
Huh.
history and etymology
Hmm.
term that's really. I mean, clearly
Hmm.
in this region.
Hmm.
Where they're Coptic and gives rituals.
Hmm.
Syrians, their neighbors. So,
Mhm.
do you have sources extrapolating from the multilingual proximity?
That's a great question. I think one of the places to begin to get a sense of that would be from manuscripts and the way that manuscripts are laid out. And I need to do more work on that. But you see, already you see, for example, during a period when the Coptic community, when Coptic as a language became the liturgical language and the community was on an everyday basis was more and more Arabized, you see that multilingualism at play in a kind of nexus of Coptic Arabic and sometimes Coptic Arabic Syriac or Syriac Arabic, that kind of thing. How one extrapolates, and I'm working on a project editing a text actually from a different site in Egypt, which is a kind of a trilingual text that is primarily Coptic, Sahidic Coptic, with Arabic translations and some really, really horrible sections of Greek, as well as some Bohairic Coptic. But so we've been asking ourselves this question: how do you take like the physical object like that, and how do you extrapolate that or not into a sort of a picture of what's happening on the ground liturgically? And that has to do with like how texts were used, right? That particular text is a processional liturgy, which presents its own interesting thing because it's movement within space. And do we envision them carrying it, or do they have it memorized? And this is kind of a reference, So that would be one beginning of an answer to your question. I also think that if we frame it in ritual terms as opposed to strictly liturgical terms, that's potentially a much wider field. I've done a lot of work in ritual studies, and I'm very keen on kind of expanding our purview of what the settings of ritual practice are, including scribal practice, right? So one of the questions related to this other text I'm working on, it's a late text, 15th, 16th century, at a time when the monastery that it was produced in effectively was no longer active. And so what does that mean? So does that mean were they engaged in a procession over a monastic landscape that was partially defunct? That's interesting. Were they producing this text as its own sort of like virtual ritual practice, right? Like a scribal ritualization of a practice that is no longer done in physical movements. So I find your question very generative, and I think it can lead in a whole range of directions. I think with regard to the specific Ethiopian community, one of the things I'm very interested in is being able to take a closer look at, with a colleague with the linguistic skills to do this with me and for me, to look at these Ethiopic texts in the Monastery of the Syrians and see how they're laid out. Do we have side by side Ethiopic and Arabic, for example? That would be indicative.
It would be interesting. Tradition in Ethiopia. That precedes the date. And so there could be some very, very.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Steve, it's quite clear to us that to be able to do this type of work, you have to be versed in many areas of interest. And I want to thank you for the presentation. At the earlier part of your presentation, in defining the kinds of approach you're going to take, you made a distinction between missiological interest, historical and ideological interest. And of course, you told us that you are more concerned with the last two, and which I find quite interesting. Now, my question then relating to that is that to what extent is the whole history that we're talking about and the narratives that we're looking at influenced and dictated by the conquest of that region, by the Muslims and Arabs? I ask that because the first reference to the Christian community during the Hijrah of Islam was to Ethiopia and the King Nagus that you also mentioned in the text, where he was described as a black man, and Muslims cite that story as a way of not only showing the relationship they have with Christianity, but also with blacks. So it seems to me then that conquering Egypt, and of course their historians and their scholars and theologians coming in and rewriting their history and interpreting what they met, will produce a type of a result that will be, we can compare to be missiological, so to say, or ideological, well, not necessarily historical. So how can we sort of sort this out in terms of how we interpret this tradition?
Right. I mean, I think those are, by the way, I would love to get that source that you're referring to from you. If I'm hearing you correctly, your observation of how certain Muslim historians are identifying this figure as black shows that malleability, how different discourses frame that question in different ways for different purposes. And I agree.
How ultimately the movement of Muslims and Arabs to that region, and ultimately the conquest of the region, will sort of influence how they write about it and interpret the history. Given the fact that the sources are mainly very Arabic and Islamic.
Unquestionably, I think if we're talking about the medieval period, once Egypt becomes Arabized, and even the Christian communities begin to produce literature in Arabic, right? the kind of flourishing of Christian Arabic literature in Egypt really, I mean, there's some as early as like the original literature, as early as the 10th century, but the 13th century is the heyday of that kind of literary productivity. You see incredible intersections and mutual influences. It doesn't just go one way, right? It's not just Christians adopting certain kinds of Islamic motifs and themes or traditions. It runs both. The influence runs both ways, and that's one of my great interests in that area. I agree very much with what you're saying about how in each of these contexts, in each of these, whatever lens we take in a particular historical context, I'm very, very interested in the discursive creation of these traditions that aren't, you're right, I mean, by modern Western historical standards, they're not engaged in sort of like historical critical work, right? They're producing and reinforcing aspects of the identity of their communities in the production of this literature, right? So the question I would ask is, when it comes to, for example, the history of the churches and monasteries, what is at stake for the editors of this text in their representation of the Ethiopians as other in this particular way? One could ask that question on this earlier literature as well. Is that? Yeah. Okay.
We have time for one, maybe two more questions. I've been told I'm supposed to respect the holding of the microphone. So if you have the microphone, apparently you have priority. But I don't know where the microphone is. There's a microphone. Anybody has their hand up? Oh, okay. Suzanne. Comes the microphone.
Thank you, and thank you so much for this really wonderful beginning to what is, I think, going to be just a really terrific conference. And I have a question along the same lines of initially Skip's point and then Jacob's and others, having to do with the question of the concreteness of some of these terms, both in terms of color and in terms of geography. Because it's also certainly true that where Ethiopia is located is not fixed for a long period of time. And so there are early maps with Ethiopia over in Chad, for example, right? And there are also questions about, going back to Nubia context, about, you know, how much of a broad-ranging, diverse population get thrown into the category of Nubia or here Ethiopian, where they're coming from. But I want to add another element to it, and here I'm speaking mostly as a West Africanist, where color takes on pretty rich metaphoric qualities. And so in your reading of these texts, they certainly sounded very physically descriptive. But there are other ways in which, and to go back to Egyptian painting, red, black, and white don't necessarily designate race in physiognomic attributes. So there are ways in which this kind of metaphoric and elements of differentiation one from another for visual or other means. But if one is going to stick with red as a physical attribute, it would be equally apt for Berbers, who are to the west of this area and all the way into to the north in Siwa and the great oases there, and sort of thinking about Christian communities within the broader Coptic trading network, presumably Berbers and otherwise. But there also may be something metaphoric of linking red in some way as a mediating color or attribute with two different ones that may have less to do with physical qualities than something else altogether.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. You see the ways, the malleability of that in the story of Moses, the Ethiopian, in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, where they're playing with, in that case, with categories of white and black, and it's a kind of a shifting terrain. I got to say, I mean, one of the things that motivated me to include, you started with questions about geography, for example. One of the things that motivated me to include that section, as well as the final section, was I was reading Van Wyck Smith's work, which is this, The First Ethiopians, which was a treatment of, I can't remember it's on your bibliography, but he's talking about these. He wants to frame it as a discursive study. He wants to study discourses of these things. At the same time, throughout that book, I found that book intriguing and frustrating because he's also asserting certain kinds of like genetic, physiological realia somehow mixed in with discussions of discourses, right? And so I was trying to, for myself, on the geographic side of things in terms of labeling, that was as much for me as for you. Just to sort of remind myself of like, what are the grounding assumptions that I'm working with as I proceed into this topic? So it was kind of a helpful check to say, and we all know this, obviously, right? We all know we use Africa in different ways. But to remind myself in terms of framing what I'm trying to do, if I'm going to talk about, say, this one particular regional community, how do I talk about that at a conference that's about Christian Africa, medieval Africa, right? And I started to get into the varying. I was trying to give a full, fleshed out account of the varying ways that those identities were being negotiated on the fly within these communities, right? Sometimes with very different things at stake. But I agree in terms of your. This is something I need to look into more. Sorry, I'm supposed to do that, Mike. I need to do more work on the signification of red, and try to look into other sources to see the various ways that the marking of the redness of the supposed priesthood, different ways that would have had resonance. Yeah.
One more question. Do we have another question? Now that I said one more question. Yes. Oh, over. Oh.
I just wanted to ask about the map you have here.
Yeah.
What does what you didn't label 6? What is 6? And what is this map supposed to represent? I mean,
This is the known world.
the known world. Did they know there was something? What is 6, first of all?
Hold on a second. I'm having trouble reading the Arabic because it's very small. Oh, it's something of the south. I think the regions of the south or the deserts of the south or something like that.
So they knew there was something farther
Yeah.
south.
Yeah, which is right up.
Yeah. So the Ifriqiya, the word that this they did borrow this from the Greek or the Latin, right? Is that supposedly?
Yeah, it's a transliterated form.
Okay.
And so that's another reason why I think this inheritance from this earlier Roman organization of the cartographic organization of the world, provincial organization of the world. So they're inheriting certain aspects of that.
And where is this map located? Where could we find it? Is there?
So look at on the third bullet point in this book by Kramers and Wheat. It's the first figure. In fact, both of the maps are the volume 1, figure 1. It's like a if you get, it's a big thick volume, and this is like a fold out. So and both of the, like, you flip it over and there's the one with the numbers on the one side. They provide a key in French in the book. I provided a selective, just what I could fit, and things that I would be mentioning in the key here.
Are there other maps like this, but with designations for points further south?
Not in that work, no.
Well, I mean,
This is one
of.
work. This is another area I need to do more work on, right? So, and I have a colleague, Travis Zadeh at Yale, who works on sort of the fantastical and images of the world, including cartography, in the Islamic. He does Islamic studies, and there's a whole terrain of different cartographers, right, who are writing works like Kitab Surat al-Ard, Book of the Image of the Earth. So I was choosing this just out of that mix to try to literally reframe what we're thinking about.
And there is a very good book that just came out by Karen Pinto on Islamic maps and mapping, which is, I think, the first really good sort of comprehensive study of this and all these other tradition in the Islamic world, which is worth looking at. Thank you to our speaker. Could everyone join me?